Good to go? All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Soman Podcast. I've lost complete count as to what number we're actually on. So I am super excited about our guest today, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. We're going to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, this is the Soman Podcast sticker. We want to thank Pastel Pencil again for providing us with all our marketing and sticker needs. And Bryce, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. Bryce, you actually get this sticker. This one's yours. So you can drive around, put this on your car, whatever you want to do, and everyone will know that you are a part of the super cool, prestigious group that have been on the Soman Podcast.
It's an honor, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So, welcome back. It's what do we? It's the Soman Podcast conversations we would have had anyway, I think is our tagline. My name is Matt Brozick. If you notice, so Tony will probably edit this in as all the cameras are going around. Wade is not next to me, neither here nor there. So Wade had an issue come up, and so it is Bryce and I today. So hopefully we can have a conversation that isn't too boring without Wade. We should maybe, if all this goes well, we should have you back at some point because you would really enjoy Wade. We'll have a good time doing that. So want to say thank you there. We want to say thank you to Bolton and Mink Studios on the gram. They do a really good job of making sure they take care of us here. We have Tony behind the box there. He's doing a great job. And we also have Carol. I got it right, correct? I didn't screw up your name. Okay. I always get scared that I'm going to call someone the wrong name. So Carol's in here making sure that we behave. And again, we're the back to the Soman Podcast. So introduction today is we have Bryce Stenzel. Right? Did I say it right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect.
And thank you. So I hate trying to remember names because I'm just terrible at, and I have like a phobia of saying names incorrectly. But so you are a teacher, you're a historian, you're an author. Are there any other major things that I missed on the introduction?
I regard myself as a student of history.
Yeah. Yeah, and isn't that interesting how you and I had a conversation a couple of months back when we had talked about doing this, and you and I hit off the bat pretty easily because you and I went right into, I think we talked about William Tecumseh Sherman's biography, and like we went way into it.
Well, and we both have a mutual friend, Arn Kine,
yes,
who's obviously well known in this area as a Civil War historian in his own right, and he was a former educator. In fact, I believe you had him as a teacher,
6th grade, yeah.
And he speaks very, very well of you. So we do have a mutual friend, and of course, Arn and I have known each other for a long time.
Well, and the two things that I wanted to tell quick stories about before we get into anything that's really serious. So, and both of them involve Arn. So, I growing up.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah. It's Arn Kine, by the way. Yeah. But so two things that I think were really interesting. So when I was growing up, I thought school was really dumb. My mom tells the story about I lived on East Main Street, 2905 East Main, and right up the street was Kennedy Elementary. And so
I went to school when I started out.
There you go.
Kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, and then they moved all the bus kids had to go to Washington.
Oh, okay.
Shouldn't say had to go. It was a good move.
Yeah.
But
so 2905 East Main. My mom tells the story of I go to school on first day of 1st grade, and she goes out to the end of the driveway to watch me walk home, and because I think my little sister was napping, whatever. And she says that the bell was still ringing by the time I got to the driveway because I ran so fast, saying I hate school. It's too long. I'm never going back.
Wow.
So I had a school I thought was just really boring when I was growing up, and then I went to 6th grade. So hopefully, Arn Kine, if you're watching, when I went to 6th grade, I was very blessed to have Mr. Kind as a 6th grade teacher, and his passion around history completely ignited an entire different way of how I thought, and the willingness to learn and want to learn and just loving information.
And I get that completely because now this is interesting. He student taught for Keith Matheson, who taught at Washington for many years. Keith Matheson was my 5th grade teacher, and I regard him in much the same way. But I mean, their styles of teaching are very, very similar.
Yes.
And obviously it inspired both of us. So,
Yeah.
We're talking a generation perhaps different. No, I'm not saying they're old or anything, but you can edit that part out. But at any rate, it's interesting that we have that. I think you and I are kindred spirits in
Yes.
that way.
And what was interesting too is now I go on, leave sixth grade, and two things that I wanted to bring up on the podcast today is one is that spark, that history spark of just learning. The biggest difference that I found with him is it wasn't just a date, which today is the 15th of April.
And we'll come back to that.
And we're going to come back to that because that's a very specific date on why you're here and a big date in history. But it wasn't just a date in history. It was learning about the people's lives around that and the stories and like all the feelings and the emotions and the ties and the people and the community, like all of those things. I think what we have a hard time is we disconnect that. Like those are just dead people that lived a long time ago. It's like, no, that was a community. Those are people that all lived. They wrote diaries. They read books. They had families. And so to learn about history from that perspective and to empathize with their scenario and their situation, that's what he taught me. And I found so valuable. And I ended up going to the University of Minnesota Duluth and getting a history and philosophy degree largely because of that passion that he had, that he instilled in me for learning, and it just happened to be about history.
Yeah, he makes you feel like you're part of it.
Yes,
and that's very, very much what it takes.
Yes,
and as a you asked me what else I did. I portray Abraham Lincoln. That's what I try to do when I'm portraying a specific individual. Is try to make people believe that for those few minutes while they're watching me, that he's actually speaking to them.
Mm-hmm. And so speaking of that, you've been portraying Abraham Lincoln for a lot of years.
30 years.
30 years. So I was at Fort Union as a 7th and 8th grader, and I went to Civil War camp, which for those that don't know, there was a number of guys, including Mr. Kind and a number of other people, Les Copendreyer, a couple other educators and others, that put together a Civil War camp for kids. And that was one of my favorite things that we ever did. One of the unique parts that we did with that is that we got to sleep over and do pull guard duty at Fort Snelling.
I reviewed the troop, so I probably reviewed you
You
as
did.
a young man.
And so what was interesting is I didn't remember your name from back then, but when Arn connected us and we were talking on the phone, I'm like, God, I feel like I remember this guy. There's something familiar about him. And so when I saw your picture,
if I had two faces, would I wear this one? Sorry, that's one of his jokes.
And so when I saw your face, I'm like, that's exactly it. So you and I actually have I've known of you since I was in 7th grade, which has been 25 years ago or something like that. But so one thing I wanted to say is thank you for doing that, because going back as a kid and being in, basically mustering as a Union soldier, eating hardtack and pulling guard duty at Fort Snelling, that was really cool when we had Abraham Lincoln stop by and address the soldiers and look at us.
Well, you're more than welcome. It was my honor and privilege to do that.
Yeah. So I think I got certificates at the end of it, for, that I served in the Union Army and all of that. And I think your signature might even be on that as Abraham Lincoln. And so I still have those. I have a hat collection. I'm kind of a nerd with regard to hats, and I still have my Fort Union
I have
hat.
one too.
Yep, with the bugle on it.
And a T-shirt.
And a T-shirt. Yep, I still have them. Yep. So that was 25 years ago. And so first of all, I just wanted to say, number one, thank you to Arn Kind. So thank you very much, Mr. Kind. And then thank you to you for doing that, because that was a very cool thing. Now looking back as an adult, that was very impactful for me as not only a college student in my learning, but also moving forward and really nerding out through history. And actually my final in college is even more nerdy, which is I studied the Civil War in England, which basically the War of the Roses, which was my main study was. We have no viewers now. Everybody has completely shut this off at this point. But I studied I got to remember this now. It was 1455 to 1471, which was the first and second Battle of St. Albans, and a gentleman by the name of Richard Neville, who was the Earl of Warwick, who his nickname was the Kingmaker. So long story short, whoever he picked in battle ended up becoming the king. So I won't go into all of it, but so that's the extent of my my nerdiness when it comes to history, which is extensive. So first, again, just want to thank you so much for what you've done in the past. Secondly, I want to thank you for being here. And then I guess at this point, I don't know where else we want to go, but those are the two things that I wanted to talk about.
Well, we can go back to the significance of today's date.
Great. Yep. Great example.
Today is the 15th of April, and yes, in most years it's tax day, but that's not the significance that I want to talk about today. Today is actually the 156th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death. He was assassinated on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, and he was shot, depends which book you read, but it's somewhere between 10:13 and 10:15 in the evening. Of course, that's before they had daylight savings time. I was thinking about that last night. It's like, now do I commemorate it at the time it would have been, or do I commemorate it, an hour ahead of that? I decided to go with Washington, D.C. time, which would be an hour ahead of us. At any rate, he was shot at between 10:13 and 10:15 in the evening, and then lasted 9 hours, which, if you think about that, I mean, the man must have been very physically strong to survive a gunshot wound, and, he never regained consciousness, he would have likely been a vegetable, if he would have even survived. And, of course, there's the medical people today say, oh, yeah, we could have saved him. Well, I don't think they could have.
No, and he was shot by John Wilkes Booth.
Right.
In the Ford Theater.
Correct.
Okay. And so he was shot from behind.
Correct.
And so there was what kind, was it a Dillinger pistol? What?
It was it was a single shot Derringer pistol.
Derringer, sorry. Yeah.
And it fired a lead ball and went through the back of his skull and actually fractured the occipital plates in the skull, which is why during, and I don't want to get too gruesome here, but during the viewings, because he had 12 funerals, when they brought the body back across from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, upon his wife's request that it be buried in Springfield. But at any rate, it cracked those plates in the skull, and that's why there was all this discoloring. There was a lot of discoloration, and by the time they got back to Springfield, the face was almost black from the bruising. And of course, the undertakers had quite a task to make him presentable each time this casket was opened. So it's kind of an interesting story all the way around. I mean, the conspiracy, what led up to it, the actual murder in Ford's Theater, and then the aftermath, which I call the Black Pageant, because that's what it was called. And I've been fortunate enough actually or I've had the honor, the privilege of actually marching in Lincoln's 150th anniversary funeral procession in Springfield, Illinois. And so I got a sense of what that would have been like.
And so I find, I'm a very amateur Lincoln historian, very amateur. I would say that I know a little bit of history about a lot of things. Other than the final I had in college about the War of the Roses, that's the only thing I've really spent a really a lot of time on. And so tell us a little bit about the significance of Abraham Lincoln and why why you find him so interesting and want to bring to light his legacy.
I found him interesting from the time I was a little boy growing up here in Mankato. My dad was a World War II veteran, so I think it starts with that. I grew up with a strong sense of patriotism, and my parents instilled me this sense of right and wrong, this sense of truth. You need to tell the truth at all times. The stories that we read in my kindergarten classes, reinforced that. In those days, when we had both Lincoln's and Washington's birthday separate. It's before the President's Day holiday came into being. At any rate, they used to show this black and white movie, one of those 16 millimeter reel. I know I'm dating myself. This is obviously before even beta video came out, let alone VHS or DVD or anything else. But anyway, they'd show this film every year of his life, and he fascinated me. And I think the physical aspects of his face, that always fascinated me too. And I never dreamed as a boy that I would, someday portray him. So that wasn't it. The interest transcends, my physical resemblance by far. That was a happy coincidence, but that wasn't the reason that I got interested. I think it's for those other reasons that I mentioned. But then as I got older, I learned that Lincoln actually had taken an active role in pardoning 265 of the original 303 Native American men, Dakota warriors that were to be executed here in Mankato. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, the President of the United States is taking his time, and he had a million other things to do. A little thing called the Civil War, among others.
Only the bloodiest thing that has ever happened in our history.
And even though I didn't know much about that at the time, I knew that the president, he's an important person. And I was actually taught to revere the presidency. I mean, that's no longer the case today. I realize that, but back in my day, we were still taught, that the president was the boss. In fact, I remember Richard Nixon's voice, of all people, but nonetheless, he had a very strong, authoritative voice, and it's like, that's my president. He's talking to me, and so I had that same sort of reverence, I think, for Lincoln. But the fact that he would involve himself so directly and take such a personal role in trying to sort out what was happening, that still fascinates me. I still get goose pimples when I read, what Lincoln was doing at the time, and so obviously it bothers me a great deal. Getting into the topic for today, this whole cancel culture, and I'm calling our podcast, the assassination of Lincoln's legacy, because we're talking about it on the anniversary of his death. But this whole idea, this whole notion that's come out here in recent years that we can simply tear down the Lincoln statues and he doesn't deserve to be called the great emancipator. I mean, that's a separate issue, but I mean, he was dealing with emancipation at the same time. But all of this anger and this hostility and this what I call cancel culture, the idea that you can just simply, if you don't like something, you can pretend it didn't exist or get rid of the people that were supposedly responsible. And so much abuse has been heaped on Lincoln lately, to the point where statues are being torn down, they're being defaced. Out in Portland, Oregon, last fall, they had a Lincoln statue that was torn down in one of the city parks there, and painted on it was 38 plus 2. It's a reference to the fact that 38 Native Americans were executed. It was the nation's largest mass execution ever. But also, and this should be pointed out, Lincoln pardoned the most number of people of any execution in American history. So I mean, it cuts both ways. And we're only talking about part of the story. We're not talking about the 265 that were pardoned.
And what
that was unheard of for that time.
Completely agree. And I think what's so interesting about that is everybody is so nuanced, meaning like every person that has ever existed is so nuanced to where you take one thing that somebody did or didn't do and then paint over every other thing that they've done for the rest of their lives. Exactly. and hang them or glorify them for that one thing. Exactly. It's like you have other presidents have done this. You have, as an example, Kennedy. There are people that look at Kennedy as one of our, great presidents, et cetera. He had some other issues that were some pretty big issues that you wouldn't necessarily want your son to grow up to act like. But that's the hardest part that I have. We gave the historical example, because I read his biography lately, is William Tecumseh Sherman. He was a Union general that was out you know this stuff way better than I am, but he was out on the western frontier of the war. He was along the Mississippi River. He ended up going through the Savannah, Georgia, burning that to the ground, which is awful.
Yeah, the infamous March to the Sea.
March to the Sea and all of that. But the point of it, and he was at Vicksburg, correct, too? I believe, yes.
Yes. And Shiloh.
And Shiloh, yes.
Shiloh.
And what was so interesting, you bring up Shiloh as an example. So when I'm reading his biography, and I find this so interesting, is when he was in battle, he was a complete savage. Like he was going to win that battle.
Well, and he came up with the idea of containment and concentration too for the Native Americans and wipe out their food supply.
Yep.
The Plains Indian Wars, which are a direct result of the U.S.-Dakota War.
Yes.
Interrupt your train of thought, but he was part of that too.
He did some things that are viewed today as completely reprehensible. But he also, as just an individual, when he went to the academy, to the what would it be called, the Army, what's their, I'm drawing a blank.
Well, he was a West Point
graduate. Thank you. So when he went to West Point, he loved to paint. He loved art. He loved culture.
The military academy. Yeah.
Yes, he went to the military. But I mean, this was a guy who, I believe it was in the Battle of Shiloh, which I apologize to, I think it was Ron Chernow who ended up. It was Ron Chernow, I think, that wrote that book. But anyway, so Ron, if you're watching, which you're not, I apologize for screwing this up. But what was so interesting about that guy is you would read a chapter about how he was being such a savage. And on the other side, you would read about how in the Battle of Shiloh, he had, I think, 4 horses shot out from underneath him as he's going up and down the lines, keeping his guys on point on their guns and keep firing when there's a lot of stuff going on that's really bad in front of them. And he wrote to his brother, and he talks about how he felt so bad for those horses because they didn't choose to be there. He made them be there, and because of his actions, they died. He talks about how he lost the people or the other soldiers, and the way he wrote these letters, especially to his brother, because that he penned back and forth to his brother a lot. It was so empathetic and so emotional that you read the next chapter about what he did during the battle, and it was almost like you're reading about a completely different person, but all in one. All summed up in one. And so that, to your point, again, that's just a long side note, but to your point, to take Lincoln and say that, or any person for that matter, that he did X, there was the largest mass execution. You look on the other side, he's like, yeah, he pardoned as many of those people. And on top of that, he didn't live in 2021.
That's right.
And he was living and was the president between, you're going to get the, he died in 1865. When was he originally elected president?
1860.
1860,
and
right.
he took office in 1861. So
that's
he served
right.
those 4 years, 1861 and 1865.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean.
Was reelected, but then he was shot, a month into his second term.
Yeah. So, like everything, people have to understand that people and situations are nuanced, and there are things that you can't just paint a brush that says this is that. It's like, no, there's a lot of stuff around.
Well, and you
this.
have to judge a historical figure in the context of their own time.
That's exactly right.
And so to claim that Lincoln was racist, which I don't believe, he said some off-color things, one of which I'm going to share with you, which is what gets people so upset. I'm going to address that.
Sure.
Why people are so upset. But to call him a racist, I think is totally unfair because in the context of his time, he was actually ahead of his time.
Exactly.
He did say some off-color things, but being a racist, no, I don't agree with that assessment.
What was something that you want to say that or bring up that he said?
Okay, well, in 1858, and your point is very well taken because Lincoln evolved as a human being.
As we all do.
In 1858, he said what I'm going to share with you, but by 1865, he's talking about giving black men the right to vote. So he's evolved because in this paragraph that I'm going to read you, it's actually a speech from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And it was given in Charleston, Illinois, so it's September 18th, 1858. Now, just to put that in historical context, Minnesota becomes a state on May 11th of the same year. So that's what the time period we're dealing with. It's just before the Civil War. Lincoln, of course, is running for U.S. Senate against Stephen Douglas, who puts him in a very bad position. I mean, Stephen Douglas, even in his time, was a racist, and I'm not saying that to pick on Douglas. I mean, I've read his stuff, and he definitely was a racist. But Lincoln had to defend himself. He's anti-slavery, yes, but he's not an abolitionist. Douglas is trying to paint Lincoln as an abolitionist, as an extremist at the time, and so Lincoln has to counter that, and he does it. I'll read you what he said. I will say then that I am not or ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And by the way, they applauded that. That I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes or of qualifying them to hold office or to intermarry with white people. And see, that was a big point, was Douglas was trying to paint Lincoln into a corner and say, well, if you want to stop the spread of slavery, which of course he does, you're automatically saying you're an abolitionist and you automatically want to have assimilation, you want to have black voting rights and so on. And so Lincoln's defending himself and saying, no, I don't. I've never been in favor of that. But just because I don't, and then he goes on to say, just because I don't want to have a black woman for a wife doesn't mean, I don't want her to be free to eat the bread that she earns with her own hands, that kind of thing. I'm paraphrasing. Okay, so you go from that, and that's one of the things they're really upset about. Oh, Lincoln's a racist, because he said he never wanted to have voting rights. That's in 1858. 3 days before he's assassinated in 1865, he's advocating in a speech that he's giving at the White House. I mean, this is a public address at the White House, official, presidential address, which, by the way, everybody was surprised at, that he's even talking, about Reconstruction. They wanted a victory speech, rah, rah, we beat the South, all that. They didn't get that. They got a very sobering assessment of the situation, a very searing. In fact, there are a lot of people that were even turned off by this, and they thought, what's he doing?
And there were a lot of people, politicians, public, everybody that wanted now to punish the South.
Right.
At that point.
Exactly. And of course, Lincoln in his second inaugural, he laid it out with malice toward none, with charity for all. And he blamed slavery on both sections, that the North was as guilty of slavery as the South was. And so therefore the North had no right to punish the South because they were both guilty of the sin. He called it the sin of slavery. Okay, now does that sound like a racist to you?
And I think your point, you have to understand from their time.
Right.
You can't judge what they said in 1858 or in 1865 on 2021.
And someone who was listening in their time was John Wilkes Booth, because he's standing out on the lawn listening to this speech, and he says, now by God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he's ever going to make. Because here Lincoln is advocating for black voting rights. And he makes a statement. He says, I want it for the very intelligent. Well, he means the educated. Now, today that's looked upon as being racist. Well, it wasn't in 1865. In fact, it was the opposite reaction.
It was very progressive
Booth,
at that point.
That's when historians think that it clicked in Booth's mind. Okay, well, I'm not going to even mess around with trying to kidnap Lincoln anymore, because that was his original plan. If we had more time, we could talk about the conspiracy, but we'd be here all night.
Yeah.
So anyway, Booth changed his plan from kidnapping Lincoln, because now the war is essentially over, Lee surrendered. There's no point in trying to exchange prisoners. That's what the kidnapping plot was supposed to accomplish, the exchange of Confederate prisoners of war for the life of the president. And Lincoln would probably make a joke out of that and say, well, you wouldn't get very many back. But at any rate, no, Booth, in his mind, it's like, no, it went from that kidnap plot to now I'm going to kill the guy. Now, by God, I'm going to put him through. And, of course, he does 3 days later. So that's how that ties into our anniversary of today.
Yeah.
But you see how Lincoln evolved,
Yeah.
From what many claim is very racist statement to where he ended up. And of course, that evolution was brought about by the war. It was brought about by the death of his own son, Willie, in the White House, which I think, it's a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt. Polio gave him an empathy toward people that were suffering. Well, I think Lincoln's losing his own son gave him even, not that he didn't have it before, but even a greater empathy for the suffering of the people who lost sons in battle. I mean, he understood that, and his heart bled for that.
I also think about him, whether you love him, hate him, dislike him, like him, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you think about the decisions and the signatures that he signed a piece of paper or he told someone to do something. The decisions he made every day were life and death for the people all around the country. The amount of proliferation of a single decision every day, and he was going through many, but any of those letters that he's answering, any of the generals that he's talking to, any of those things, I just can't imagine. On top of that, when you have Mary Todd, who's completely distraught at Willie's death. So Mary Todd is Lincoln's wife, correct? Am I getting that right? Yes. And Willie passes. How old was Willie, his son?
He was 11.
So now you lose an 11-year-old son. You have the entire country either loving or hating you, and now you have these progressive ideas of doing things that some people are in favor of and some people are willing to assassinate you for. And I mean, I just can't imagine the weight every day of going through that, knowing that you're making decisions to where hundreds of thousands of people are dying, Americans, not like World War II, where it's like there's some Japanese dying and some Americans, or Germans and Americans, or it's everybody's killing each other.
And he felt those deaths personally, and he felt the Southerners' deaths as well as the North. I mean, to him, they were all his, by extension, they were all his children.
Yeah,
he was Father Abraham, and I grew up, learning that, and I believe it.
And I've read a lot of the literature on Lincoln, and I really truly feel, especially if you read what he penned, if you read that, I mean, you can hear the sympathy and empathy, and almost like heartbreak in the decisions that he had to make.
And I sensed that as a kid. You asked me how I got it. I think even as a child, I felt like he was talking to me. I was like one of his boys.
And isn't that interesting how a historical figure, someone who you and I have never met, will never meet in this lifetime, and through the words that they said and were written down, or the things that they wrote down personally or publicly, how they transform, or what's the right word? It doesn't matter what age or generation that you're in, the love, hate, heartbreak, all of those things, they transcend time. They're all a part of the human condition, whether you're in 1865 or you're in 2021.
Well, see, Lincoln, to make that connection complete, Lincoln was able to do on paper what Arnkind does in the classroom.
Yes.
Or what Keith Matheson did in the classroom to inspire us.
Yes. So what was it about Lincoln, about was it his oratory? Was it his ability to connect with people, or the speeches that he wrote? What was so amazing and unique about him as a politician to be able to accomplish the things that he did?
I think it's all of that. I think he did have that ability to communicate, particularly written communication. I mean, his writings are considered some of the finest in Western literature. I mean, we're not just talking American literature. We're talking, and that he's got some pretty stiff competition with Shakespeare and all the other great writers, but his stuff is right up there. So I think his ability to write, and that's all the more amazing when you consider how he learned to read in the first place. He learned to read by copying Bible passages. Well, that's where a lot of that language, that King James English, he borrows. And if you look at the Second Inaugural, for example, there's a number of religious references. I mean, you can look them up. I have looked them up where they actually came from. Judge not that ye be judged, and so on.
Yeah.
There's quite a number of them, quite a number of those religious phrases that he borrows, but all he had to learn to read with was, as I said, reading passages, and that's not an easy thing to do, even for us that can read now. Imagine trying to learn your letters by reading Bible passages.
King James version.
It's quite amazing, and his formal schooling was less than a year. Both of us have had 3-4 times as much schooling as Lincoln did. So look what he started with, and then here he's considered one of the great. I mean, it's an amazing story. It really is. I mean, it's more than just the rags to riches, and from being poor. A lot of people did that, but it even goes beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. And what I thought was interesting too, and again, correct me if I'm wrong because you're the expert, but the politicians in that era were very long-winded. It wasn't. It wasn't unusual for a speech to go on for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. It was an entire afternoon. I mean, people would set up picnic blankets, and you. It was as much.
It was much show. It was much. As much entertainment as it was actually information.
Yep.
I mean, they combined the two.
Yep.
It was news and information, but it was also entertainment.
And you contrast that to the Gettysburg Address. What is that, 3 minutes or something? Like, it's not very long.
Yeah, 2.5 to 3 minutes,
2.5 3
depending
minutes.
on the speaker.
Yep. And you take that and
272 words, 10 sentences.
Wow, that's amazing.
We can do it at the end. If you want.
Yeah, that'd be cool. That'd be way cool. I just find so interesting how contrasting he was on his oratory to be able to concisely put together the Gettysburg Address in a way that was so opposite of the pomp and circumstance and all the, like you said, the show of what they did back then.
The preceding speaker at Gettysburg was a gentleman named Edward Everett.
Yes.
And his whole speech was 1 hour and 56 minutes. Lincoln was actually sitting down after he gave his 2-minute oration because the photographer thought, the photographer was going to take a picture. And he thought, oh, well, he's going to be up there for quite a while. Lincoln's already sitting down when the picture is snapped, and so you get just a little bit of the top of his head.
Really?
I mean, it's a very blurry. It's not a good picture at all, but that's all there is because
it was done so quickly.
It was done so quickly. Wow. I mean, the big stylized portrait that you see. And by the way, Lincoln did understand the importance of the public image. He's the first president to be extensively photographed. And that started at the beginning when he was running in 1860. But that big, and this is my favorite, when he's looking straight into the camera, the 1863 one, that was actually taken prior to Gettysburg, in a studio. But actually live when he's doing the speech, there is only one photograph that we know of, and he's already beginning to sit down by the time the shutter. And of course, in those days, if you moved it all, everything blurred. So that's why we don't have a real good image. But it's precisely for that reason, because his speech was so short. But yet that's what people remember. He was wrong in one respect when he said the world will little note or long remember what we say here. And notice he's shifting. He's trying to put the emphasis on what the soldiers did.
Yes.
When people talk about his sense of humility, I think that was real. I don't think that was fake.
Well, it would be hard to fake that much.
Right.
Right. And I think that is so interesting because so often a politician, whether you're in 1790 or you're in 2021 or anywhere in between, oftentimes it's about, hey, look at what we did. Look at it's all those bad guys, those people that don't know what they're doing. Look at what we did, or look at what I did. And I think that's so interesting, like you had just said, about how humble a lot of his passages, his words, and his speeches are, and just a very, very unique person. And so, again, to our point, to take him and paint him as a racist or something to that effect, really is disingenuine, because that's a nice way to say it, is incredibly disingenuine because of all the other things and characteristics of him as a person.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. That's the point that historians who have actually looked at Lincoln, this knee-jerk reaction to, tearing down the statues and so on, I just think it's totally inappropriate and not justified whatsoever. I don't support statue removal at all, even the Confederate statues. Now, I'm no fan of the Confederacy, never have been, but I don't think they should be taking down statues of Robert E. Lee. Or any of the Confederate leaders, because they're more complicated. They're more complex than simply one, snapshot, as you said. We pull them out of context. We look at one thing that they did, that we don't like.
Yep.
Robert E. Lee, for example, yes, he led the Army of Northern Virginia, but when it was over with, he actually worked to try to reunite after the war. And there's an incident where he actually was in a church in Richmond, worshiping in a church. And there were black parishioners, they actually came up to the altar rail to kneel, and of course, can't do that. This is horrible, because that had never been done. Well, Robert E. Lee's standing in the back of the church. He sees this. He goes up and he kneels with them. And that was telling the rest of the congregation that it's okay.
It's okay, yeah.
It's okay.
If he'll do it, then it's okay.
That took guts. That took courage.
It absolutely does. And I've never heard that story.
I think it took more courage for him to lose and surrender his army and then tell them to go home and not take up their arms against the Union anymore. When I read that, it's like, okay, this guy, he deserves some credit, some recognition. Well, and when he was going to be put on trial for treason, U.S. Grant stepped in and said, "Not on my watch.
Yeah,
it's not going to happen." And Lee was allowed to, because I promised him, I gave him my word. And back in those days, your word was your bond.
Yeah, that meant a lot.
Which
meant
is
everything.
Something that I wish would carry over to the present. But anyway,
Yep.
Nonetheless, Grant said, "Nope, he's not going to stand trial. I gave the man my word that he could go home, and that's what it's going to be. And if you fight me on that, I got my whole army that's going to take you out."
I got a lot of guys that'll do whatever I say,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And what I find is so interesting too. If you think about it, let's just say as an example that Robert E. Lee.
It was honor meeting honor.
Yes,
is what it was.
Absolutely. And what is also this is a side note now. What I also find so interesting is you see Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, I believe, and you look at those two people, just the way they dressed, and it was so hilarious. You have Robert E. Lee, which was just
immaculate.
Every button was shined, everything. And then you have Grant, who comes in basically a private's uniform,
which was muddy. It was mud spattered. In fact, he apologized for his appearance. I think he was embarrassed. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, because Lee's got the
I would
sword,
be.
everything. Yeah, absolutely. And he comes in and he's just full of mud, and it's like, sorry about that, but
didn't have time to go home and clean up first,
have
change
a cigar
clothes
and a whiskey. But I find that so interesting. And the other thing with like the cancel culture thing that I think is so interesting, and Ryan Sturgis, who was our last person that was in here for the last podcast, we were talking about this as well, and I find, let's just hypothetically say that Robert E. Lee is an absolutely terrible human with a lot of bad ideas. to tear him down, to tear his stuff down and completely erase him from history. If someone's got a really bad idea or a good idea, I want those ideas to be out there. The freedom, the freedom to express ideas. Because if it's really crappy, really bad, one, I want people to find out that it's really crappy, really bad, and that we shouldn't do it. And if it's good, hey, great, let's all discuss that.
Well, exactly. And you raise an excellent point. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It was an excellent point.
because these cancel culture advocates, they're actually doing themselves, their causes, whatever it happens to be. If it's the African American ones that are upset because they think Lincoln's a racist, or the Native American ones because they think he led the execution, all of that. By canceling all of this history, by getting rid of it, by removing the statues and not allowing it to be discussed anymore, getting rid of the exhibits and so on, they're actually hurting their own cause because nobody knows what they're upset about.
Yes. And now you fast forward, it's like, I want to know what the bad ideas of history were. I want to know what they were, because there's like 4 different generations basically, and then it kind of just repeats.
And
I don't want us to go back to the really screwed up ideas, and retry that. Like, hey, this is a good idea. No, we tried that in the 30s. That led to a lot of crap.
That's the pendulum swing.
Yes,
I call it the historical pendulum.
Yes,
and we've gone from one extreme where, the victor wrote the history and the Indians were savages and all. I recognize that. That is out there.
Yeah.
But now we've swung completely over the other way to the point where, oh, no, the Native Americans did no wrong. That's not quite true. If you're a descendant of one of the 800 settlers that were killed, you're going to have a different perception of that.
And it's all nuanced. That's the thing. It's like none of us are perfect. Not you nor I nor anybody else. None of us are sitting here and saying, hey, we've done nothing ever wrong. It's like, it's a nuanced conversation. Let's have a conversation.
And when you study people's flaws, for example, Lincoln, it actually makes him look better because he was able to overcome a lot of that, that racist business. If you want to call that racist, whatever. He didn't stay with that.
Yeah.
When he died in 1865, he was a different man than he was in 1858. And I hope to God that I'm a better person by the time I leave this earth than I am right now.
How old was he when he died?
56.
So you look at 56 versus 52 when he wrote that. Is that am I getting that? Was that?
He wrote it in 1858.
Yeah. Okay. 58. Yeah. So a few more extra years. But I mean, you look at that. You take, let's just say, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. Any of us, you look at what you thought and did 10 years ago, it's not exactly what it is today. Some of it's the same, but it's not exactly the same. And so, I find that hard to judge him by
well, and this business that comes up that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves, I disagree with that also. Because what it did is it set the stage, it set the standard. And as the Union Army becomes the army of occupation, moving into the territories of the South, the slaves were liberated. Their charge is, and Lincoln did this very deliberately. Again, you have to understand the context of the time. He was exempting the border states, the states like Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri. There were 4 of them. Delaware was the 4th one, that actually had slavery legal but didn't secede and join the Confederacy. Well, look at Maryland. Virginia had already seceded. Maryland is here. Guess where Washington, D.C. is? It's the peanut butter and jelly in the sandwich. He had to deal with Maryland in a very careful way. Same thing with Missouri and Kentucky. Lincoln once said, he'd like to have God on his side, but he had to have Kentucky because of the border, contiguous with Ohio, or the Ohio River. He temporarily exempts those border states from the rest of what's going to be covered in the Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, he's not sincere enough. He's wishy-washy. He's this. He's waffling. Bull crap. That's not. You can edit that out. He's not. he's not being insincere. He's doing this. The man was a political genius. He understood. And by the way, he had conversations with these border state governors and so on, and they're all saying, almost to a man, nope, we're slavery's. It's almost like Wallace. Instead of segregation, it's slavery forever. That kind of thing. And so it's like, okay, then I got to do it some other way.
Yeah.
And so he issues this proclamation that in the beginning, yes, there were large areas that were exempt. But as the Union Army becomes the army of occupation, it also becomes the army of liberation.
Yes.
And many slaves heard that, they had the grapevine thing going. And so, yes, they did. And I think maybe this is where some of the cancel culture comes from. And it's great that they are. But as African Americans become more empowered, they're trying to take possession of their own history and say, we did it all on our own. We don't want to have this white guy, this whatever, honky president, whatever he was, being our leader, that it was Lincoln. But it was.
Mm-hmm.
There had to be somebody in charge at the time. Otherwise, those slaves couldn't have done what they did on their own.
And the
black troops too. The Emancipation Proclamation created, black soldiers. That's the first time that they were allowed to fight.
Yes.
It's not the first ones that ever fought in an American war.
Mm-hmm.
We had black soldiers in the Revolution, but so on. But legitimately, as soldiers, it was the first time. And it was Lincoln who equalized their pay. Yes, initially they weren't paid the same as white troops. That was fixed by June of 1864.
What's the movie?
Glory.
Glory. Thank you very much. Yes, another one of the movies that we watched in sixth grade.
And it's a great movie.
Absolutely great.
Denzel Washington, great actor. I applaud. What the steps that have been taken to bring out the stories of African Americans and heroism. There's no. But why do we have to when we're elevating one group? Why do we have to demean someone else?
Mm-hmm. It's not a zero-sum game.
No. You can recognize Lincoln for who he was and still recognize the achievements of Black Americans.
Absolutely, completely.
Why does it have to be either?
It doesn't
one
have
or
to
the
be
other.
either or. Yeah, it doesn't for some reason. And I think it has to be either or because that's the most sensational way to do it, and it drives the most clicks and viewership and sponsor dollars for whatever media outlet.
It's like there always has to be a bad guy. There has to be the man I'm going to say the man or the woman, whatever, the person on the white horse versus the person on the black horse.
Yeah.
There has to be good and evil, and it's like there's an awful lot of gray in human nature. Human motives. They can, and then it's swirling all
very
around.
little is black and white. It's like birth and death are basically as black and white as we possibly get, and then everything else is completely gray. But I wanted to switch a little bit and talk about, you had written a book on the history of Mankato. Mm-hmm. So I would like to know, because I personally don't know this, I haven't gone through it very extensively at all. I've read about the Sioux Uprising of 1862, and did I get the year right? 1862? Yes. Okay.
Yes, you did.
I'm so afraid sitting across from you because you know this stuff so well that I'm going to totally butcher everything. But so I'd like to go back.
You're doing very well.
What the city of Mankato? Like, why did they pick Mankato? Why is this place a town? Why did it grow? Aside from Minneapolis and St. Paul,
it has to do with the river, which is, as Lincoln would say, it's altogether fitting and proper that we should be sitting where we are, just a few steps from the Minnesota River.
Correct.
The Minnesota River was the great artery of transportation. It was the superhighway of its time, which brought the goods up and down the river, and that's why this town flourished. So here at the bend of the river.
So where would
and if you look at a map of Minnesota, Mankato sits right in geographically in the center.
Yep.
So all roads really lead to Mankato.
Yeah.
It was the largest. In answer to the question about why the hanging was here.
Yeah.
I used to wonder that too. Why in the world did they have it here?
Couldn't they have done it like New Ulm so we don't have the bad?
Well, see, New Ulm was totally leveled pretty much to the ground. But Mankato was a thriving community because the war never got quite this far.
Okay.
If the Indians hadn't been stopped at Fort Ridgely and New Ulm, or as Chief Big Eagle said, the defenders were very brave, meaning the defenders at Fort Ridgely were very brave and kept the door shut.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea was for them to sweep all the way down the valley, and if they could have gotten to Mankato and taken it, then the hanging would have been somewhere else. But the plan was to sweep down and take as much out as they could.
Yeah.
But it never got this far. And so Mankato was the largest community that had infrastructure. They had because they knew there was going to be an influx of people. Well, it had hotels, it had restaurants. Yes, it had bars too, but they declared martial law, so that took care of most of that, the liquor traffic. Which is ironic because one of the big advertisers later on was Standard Brewery, or I should say one of the big companies in town, but they used that hanging depicted on their bar trays for advertising. And of course, the guys are drinking their product. Well, Standard Brewery didn't even exist in 1862, and drinking wasn't allowed because there was martial law. So that's very historically inaccurate, but it's interesting nonetheless.
There's a lot of historical inaccuracies.
But as far as your question, it's infrastructure. Mankato had the infrastructure to be able to handle such a big event as that. St. Paul's too far away.
Yeah.
New Ulm and anything west of there was either just unsettled or else it was lying in ruins because of what had happened. So Mankato was kind of all roads pretty much led here.
And what I find is interesting too is Mankato still has a lot of those same characteristics where you look at the amount of people that we don't serve just the residents of Mankato, North Mankato.
Exactly. It's a regional center.
It's a very much regional hub.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, you're either going to Sioux Falls or you're going to Minneapolis. If you're not going to one of those two places, you're coming to Mankato, and that's a big swath of people. That's a lot of people, especially for our area. So,
make it Mankato is nothing new.
Yeah,
I mean they've been doing that for over 150 years.
Yeah. So when we talk about the river and how important the river was, what would the river have looked like if we were to sit back and say, 1850 as an example? Or would we have seen transports for passengers, for commerce? Would there have been docks? Would there have been? I mean, what?
Well,
would
there was
like?
there was a steamboat landing right out here, just below where you've got the flood wall today, or as I call it, the Berlin Wall, because that's what it looks like before they put the mural on it. At any rate. Where that opening is, you can walk out on that platform. That's where the steamboat landing originally was. So you had steamboats, and this is before the railroad. I mean, the railroad came too, and actually that's what doomed Mankato's rival, which was South Bend, which was just a few miles to the west. And the reason it's called South Bend is if you look at the map, it actually dips. The river dips a little bit further south. That's the southernmost point on the Minnesota River, and then it comes back up, and then it comes around at Mankato. That's the sharp bend where we are now, but actually South Bend is just a little bit to the west. It's where LaHillier is, or actually just below Hillcrest Nursing Home. That's where South Bend was, and that big oxbow is still there, where the river comes almost right up to present day 169. That was South Bend, and that's why that's called that. But the railroad bypassed it in 1868, dooming it to oblivion, whereas Mankato continued to thrive.
Because the railroads, so that came through. Railroad was here in 1868.
Yes.
Which for people that don't know, the railroad was like the greatest thing that had ever happened to commerce at that point.
Right.
For both passenger travel and for commerce.
And that actually came in. The tracks came in on North 4th Street and then came across where Washington Park is. There was a train station there. In fact, that's where Schuyler Colfax, who was Speaker of the House when Lincoln was president, and actually the last person to see him alive before he went to the theater 156 years ago last night, Schuyler Colfax was there to talk to Lincoln about Western mining, actually, was the topic. But that's why Lincoln was late to the theater, because he was supposed to be there at 8, and he got there about 8:30. Well, who cares?
He's the president.
He can do what he wants. He should have been a little bit later, and
Yeah.
maybe it wouldn't happen at all. But ironically, Schuyler Colfax died in Mankato 20 years later in 1885. On January 13th, he had a heart attack here because he was changing trains in town here. There are actually 2 stations. One was like a block away from where the Washington Park one was, and that was before the Union Depot was built. That wasn't built until 1890. That's when they put the tracks along the river the way they are now.
Okay.
But originally they came in along North 4th Street, and then that railroad yard was where Washington Park is. But I was born across the street from where Schuyler Colfax. Now, I didn't know that until I was older, so that isn't one of the initial things that got me interested in Lincoln. But when I found out that the last person to see him alive died across the street from where I was born, it's like, cool.
Yeah.
That was a revelation.
Yeah. And so how did they deal with the fluctuating water? I mean, when you talk about having a dock there, you can't just put a dock out because it'll either be underwater or the water will be so far away from it. How do they deal with docking those
There's a
steamboats?
little bit of a natural levee here, so that helped with some of that. The fact is, it was really dependent on the level of the river. Some years the river was high, and of course that was good for transport, getting things up and down the river. But it also could have its hazards too, because it hides the tree snags and everything else that are in the river. One difference between, and I asked a professor about this one time because I was curious about the very same thing. Well, why don't we have steamboats or paddle boats, excursion boats on the Minnesota River today? He said because it's too shallow. They'd have to dredge it. It hasn't been dredged in, probably ever. And it eventually silts itself in. I mean, they've got it from Savage to Fort Snelling or to Pike Island. That part they can get even today. They can get what am I trying to say? Those
barge.
Thank you. Yeah, there's barge traffic on the lower Minnesota River.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
From Savage to the confluence with the Mississippi.
Really?
But that's as far upstream as they can go. Yeah, Bunge Corporation. You see that when you're driving by on 169.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's a big loading area for grain.
Okay.
Grain transportation. So I mean, they're still using the river to some extent. It's just that they can't bring passenger steamboats and things up here. The last steamboat to come through Mankato was in 1897. It was the Henrietta that docked right up here.
Was that carrying passengers, I assume? Yeah.
Yep.
So when we're talking about getting to different places, like if I want to go to Minneapolis today, I drive there, and from here, I'm about an hour and 20 minutes, and it's not very difficult. Like, think about going from Mankato to St. Paul. First, okay, how long is it going to take you on a horse? A long time. Secondly, is you have an opportunity to go by water. So how long would it take, say, the Henrietta?
And it's cheaper to go by water. There were very few roads. And that's why the towns, if you look at the settlement of Minnesota, some of the earliest towns outside of the Twin Cities and, of course, along the St. Croix, which is the same thing. It's just a different river, like Stillwater. But, this area, most of these towns were platted in the 1850s, whereas out western Minnesota, it's like the 1870s. They had to wait until the railroad got there.
Yes.
But the reason for Mankato's relatively early settlement, I mean, it predates the state. It was founded in 1852, and the founders came from St. Paul, and they came in the wintertime. They used the river instead of having to go through the woods. It was frozen over, so they used the river like their highway, but they pulled their sleds and whatever upstream. So that's how they traveled, and it took them weeks to get here.
Well, there's a joke by a comedian, I can't remember who it is, but they talk about air travel today. We complain if we have to wait on the runway for 45 minutes to get cross country, and that's like a hardship in this country. And you talk about like back when people that went from New York to San Francisco. I mean, by the time they set out and actually got there, the joke is he talks about by the time you got there, the people that set out are all dead. It's like it's the second generation that actually make it because it took that long to get across the country. Where now we're whatever, a few movies away from getting completely across country. But what I find so interesting too is even again going back to William Tecumseh Sherman in reading his biography is in learning about how they fought the Civil War in the strategic aspects of it, and why I think Mankato is the hub that it is as well, like we're talking about, is how important rivers were, because they were the vital lines. And Sherman talks about how if we take the Mississippi, we'll be just fine. Like we'll win the war. Everything's okay. And that was a big deal, where now it's like rivers are just something we drive by or drive over.
Exactly.
It's not even a thing that we even notice.
It's an inconvenience more than anything. Only time we notice rivers is when they flood.
Yes.
Like what happened in St. Clair here a few years ago. And that was a nuisance. I was living in St. Clair at that time, and we did the sandbagging and the whole. And of course, Mankato's had some pretty big floods.
Yes.
51. Well, actually, there was one in 1908. There was the big one that some of the old timers still talk about, the 51 flood. Then there was another one in 65. And that was actually the impetus for the North Mankato Fun Days, because the people that worked on, and actually North Mankato is lower in elevation, so that's why that floods out quicker than Mankato does. But Mankato, I'm sure they had water in some of these storefronts and stuff along Front Street. I'm sure they had water in their basements. But at any rate, it's very interesting. That's a whole story in of itself. The whole flooding, or and of course we have the Corps of Engineers that came in the 70s and built. I was making fun of it a few minutes ago, calling it the Berlin Wall, which is what it looks like. But actually, it does serve a very practical purpose. And there's been times where if it hadn't been for that wall, the city of Mankato would have been inundated, and it wasn't because of the wall. So it has served its purpose, as ugly as it is.
What's cool about the Minnesota River, and one of the things, I'm a big fisherman, and so I spend a lot of time fishing on lakes just because that we have a lot of those around here. But my new goal is to go and spend more time on the Minnesota River, because the fishing's amazing on the Minnesota River, and just to take like. I don't know if I'm a historian. I'm a person who's fascinated by history. But my goal is I have a duck boat. So it's a little 14-foot boat with a 15-horse motor. And my goal, and I don't know if it's going to be this summer, probably next summer or whatever, but I want to take a trip and put in right at Veterans Memorial Bridge, and I want to go all the way to Fort Snelling.
Oh, yeah.
And just go right along the river. And what's so cool about it...
When you go, take me with you, because I've always wanted to make that trip.
Wouldn't that be amazing to do?
Yeah. And that's something that was one of these boyhood dreams. Yeah. I wanted to be like Tom Sawyer.
Yes, that's exactly right. And what I think is so interesting is so much of that river will look just like it did in 1850, in 1860, in 1871, because there's so much that's completely undeveloped. Now, you're going to have some other things that you're going to see power lines and things like that, but that I'm always fascinated. One of the reasons why I went to Civil War camp as a kid is because I want to be able to experience as much as I can of what it was like. No different than I wrote my final on Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, and I got to go to his castle in England and go like. I got to go in his bedroom. I got to go like touch the wall.
Yeah, when you get to actually look at the stuff that they actually touched, it's very meaningful.
And I feel so like my wife. I tell her this stuff, and she just looks at me like I'm a total crazy person. But like the tactile contact,
I get it
of touching. You get it, so now I can say it because you're right. We're right online. You just go in like. You touch the door handle that they touched, or you open the door, or you see like I saw where he went to the bathroom. Like I got to see all those places.
Yep. Well, that was like me, but both cases. I got to see the handrail that Lincoln used in his Springfield house. I got to put my hand. Normally they'll let you touch anything, but in that particular instance, they say this is one of the few exceptions you can actually put your hand on the same. That was cool.
Isn't it? It's
And
amazing.
then we saw the outhouse too, but
Yeah.
that's beside the
I
point.
might not touch that. I got in trouble. We were at Warwick Castle in England. I did a study abroad, and they're they tell me not to put anything. I was 21 years old at the time. They're like, well, okay, no, don't touch anything. Well, what do you think the first thing that I'm going to do? I took one of the helmets off the wall and I put it on my head. Took a great picture. It's still an amazing picture. I should probably find it and bring it up.
Of course.
But I got this sweet battle helmet on, took a quick picture, and then put it back on the wall. But I find it so interesting with that tactile contact of something that those people touched or saw or lived in, or like I got to see his armor, like what the dude put on to go joust. Like that is just so interesting to me as a person of interested in history.
Yeah, I'd have probably tried on Lincoln's top hat, except they've got it in a locked case, so they won't let they knew I was coming, but otherwise, yeah, I probably would have done that.
So, how much have you written a lot about Lincoln? Do you study him a lot? Tell me a little bit about what you've done as a historian.
I've written a number of playbooks. When I say playbooks, they're actually, and sometimes I think people think, oh, it's a play script. I'm not going to read that, but actually, it's written so that it can be acted out by students, because of course, teaching is near and dear to my heart.
Yep.
and living history stuff. I mean, just my background. That's why I wrote, and I wrote in a genre that wasn't as. If you write just a straight biography, a straight narrative, a lot of people aren't going to read it just because they think, oh, that's just another boring history. How many do we need? So I tried to do something unique with it and write it as a play script, but it's still scholarly. It's everything is cited, and it can be acted out, but you can read it as a narrative too. So I've written a number of those. In fact, I think I'm up to about altogether. I want to say I'm close to 10 books that I've written.
So I'm assuming you have visited.
And I've got a couple more in the hopper are they're done, but they're not published.
Okay, and you, I assume, have gone to battlefields, reenactments,
Yes.
that type of thing. Is that something you're passionate about as well?
All the above.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. I've been to Gettysburg several times. I've been to Ford's Theater, obviously. I've actually even been to the Army Medical Museum, which is separate, but that's where the bullet is that actually, you were talking
really?
about, up close and personal. Well, yeah, to see that bullet and think, that inanimate object, it's just a little chunk of lead, how that changed the course of American history and even world history. I mean, it's an inert object now, but think how much it changed the world. Just that little piece of lead. But I've seen the Derringer pistol. That's at Ford's Theater. I've actually been to Ford's Theater on 3 occasions when the anniversary fell on Good Friday, April 14th. That doesn't happen very often, but in my lifetime, I've been to 3 out of the 4 times that it's happened. And the reason I haven't been to the 4th time is because that'll happen in 2028.
Okay.
I got my tickets. I'm going to Washington. So, but I've actually sat in the theater, at the moment that it would have happened, which is pretty eerie.
Yeah, that is so interesting about being there, like we had talked about. The other thing, one of my big goals is I want to go. And I want to do a few reenactments. I would love to do that. I talked to Les Kopendreyer a little bit, and I'm like, dude, I want to go do that sometime. He goes, you ever want to just, here, take my gear. We're the same size. You go out there and you go be a reenactor for how does that work? Do they do it for a number of specific days, or the actual battle, or the length of the battle? How does that work for the reenactments?
It varies some. They try to get it close to the battle. For example, I went to the 150th anniversary of Shiloh. That reenactment. I was with the New Ulm Battery, and that, I think that's the way to go. Is get yourself involved with a unit that's already participating. But I went in. That would have been 2012 for that. And they had the actual mock-up battle adjacent to the battlefield because the National Park Service runs the battle. And it's the same at Gettysburg. They don't actually do with rare exception. I think now that I think about it, I think maybe Gettysburg they did allow them on the battlefield, but that's very rare. Usually it's done like in close proximity to it because they don't want modern reenactors, trampling over, maybe destroy some archaeological evidence or whatever. And it's just I think it's the sense of it that this is hallowed ground.
Yeah.
We're not going to sensationalize it.
Yep. I went to the most recent battlefield I was at was Antietam, and I went to there with my one of my really good friends, Ryan McDonough. If you're watching, remember that. So we went there, and it was what was so interesting about that was how undulated the land was, and how so much of Civil War was either you knew where to go or where people were by noise or by a visual. Like there was no radio like, hey, call in an airstrike on coordinate this, or a GPS waypoint that they put somewhere. Like that was so interesting, and how if you didn't see that there was someone over there, you didn't know unless they started blowing stuff up.
And you mentioned visual. That's a very good point, because the morning, and this happened in the real battle too, which is what made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It's like this is really it. But anyway, we were in our formation, our artillery formation. So I was with the artillery guys. Anyway, this group of Confederates, we couldn't see them. They were from you to me away, and we couldn't see them because there was such a thick bank of fog. It was just this rolling fog over the whole battlefield. And then all of a sudden, when they get to about here, they come out of and it's like, oh my God, there they are. I mean, that just...
And you think about that, all of a sudden you're doing your job, they're hanging out with your cannons, which the New Ulm Battery is a Civil War reenactor group where they're an artillery group, correct?
Yes. And actually, it's a living history group because the New Ulm Battery was original. It's one of the... I don't want to say it's the only one in the United States of its type, because once you get into absolutes, then somebody else will say, well, no, there's this one. But it's certainly one of the only groups of its type where it actually was brought into existence as a result of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. It was created the following year as a home civil defense unit. It's never been decommissioned. So we're operating as reenactors, but really we're living historians, because the unit itself is an actual military unit that existed, and the equipment is the original.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we have an 1856 cannon on an 1851 carriage.
Wow.
I mean, that's older than the state of Minnesota.
And you're cruising around with it.
So it's yeah.
Isn't that cool? But like you talk about how many times you hear about the stories of the people that fought in the Civil War, and what people also don't understand is, like, you shoot a gun today, it's smokeless powder.
Right.
Like you might get a little bit of smoke.
Oh yeah.
But back then it was like everywhere.
Right.
I mean, the whole battlefield was basically a smoke cloud.
Yep. And so if you didn't have the fog already to block your view, you're certainly going to have that blue cannon smoke, and you're absolutely correct. That comes wafting over you. There's nothing like the smell of sulfur in the morning. Anyway.
But you think about that though, like you're at your battery position, if that's the right way to say it. I don't even know if it is, but you're in your position, and between the fog and the smoke and the confusion and the noise, and all of a sudden your enemies who have bayonets fixed likely are walking through you to me, and then all of a sudden, like, everyone's going, oh shit.
And our instructions were we had to allow ourselves to be overrun, because that's what happened on the first day. What we were depicting was the first day of battle, where the Confederates actually attacked by surprise. As I said, they came out of the fog and attacked these. I mean, some of these Union guys were still having breakfast. I mean, people died with pieces of hardtack in their hands because they were bayoneted, before they could, arm themselves and get going. And the idea was to push them right into the Tennessee River, which almost happened. But then, the Union troops rallied in the second day with the help of Sherman and others. Grant was able to turn the tide. But at any rate, it was a bloodbath, certainly. But our position was overrun,
Yeah.
and we were supposed to allow the Confederates to. I didn't want to. I didn't want to yield that ground. I mean, I was like, I had my, and I know it's only I shouldn't say only. It's a reenactment. It's like why, but no, I got passionate. Dang, I'm staying here. I'm home, and my commander said no. Gotta go. Well, all right. I'll listen to him, but
Go to be insubordinate.
I didn't want to.
Yeah.
I wanted to stay at my camp, even though I'd have been dead meat.
Yeah. No, put in perspective though.
In the real war.
Do you know what the casualty number was at say Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg?
Gettysburg was 51,000 that they estimate. That's on both sides. I want to say, someone will look this up and tell me I'm wrong, but I want to say Shiloh was around 23,000.
So you take as an example, Mankato, I think the sign says, maybe you two know this better than I, but I think the sign population says like 55 or 58,000. Mm-hmm. So we're basically taking, and do you remember what Antietam was? I think it was the single bloodiest day.
That's the bloodiest single day of the war.
But you take like almost the entire population of Mankato is a casualty of war in a battle. Like that we in our modern mind do not think that way. Like we don't understand what that war was. Like you talk about a bayonet. Most people don't know what a bayonet is. It's a knife that is fixed to the end of your gun. So either when you're out of ammo,
and it makes a three-way cut when you stab somebody with it. It's got the way it's shaped. It's like a triangle, and it goes in and it makes a real jagged cut.
Yes, and what's if you think about the PTSD of these soldiers and fighting face to face, and you saw the people that you were shooting, the Minet ball was a huge.
Oh, you pronounced it right.
Did I say it right?
Arn will be proud.
Okay, good. You're welcome. Got it. But the Minet ball was a huge technological advance.
Don't say mini ball.
Yeah, the mini ball. The Minet ball is a huge technological advance that allowed them to shoot 300, 400, 500 yards. But in all reality, correct me if I'm wrong, you weren't usually shooting 500 yards away from at someone, were you? I mean, you were close-ish quarters. At that point.
Yeah. It was close order formation.
Yes.
You're talking shoulder to shoulder, and then 4, 5, 6 ranks back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of those cannon shots, could take out 3 or 4 ranks of soldiers, without any problem.
Well, and you talk about like grape shot, which is turning a cannon into a shotgun.
Yeah,
essentially
a canister. Yeah, canister. Grape shot is a form that it all comes apart. Grape shot was used mostly for taking down massive ships.
Oh, okay.
But it is. You're right. It goes in just like canister. Canister is like a shotgun shell. It's a can with 29 balls in it.
I mean, can you imagine that thing going out?
Spraying out. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's why heads and limbs and everything else were just plain gone.
Yeah. And you look at
or it went up in a red vapor. It just disappeared. Poof.
Yeah, there goes your leg. And you look at, like, Dances with Wolves is a great example of this right away when Kevin Costner is about to get his leg chopped off, and you look over in the corner and there's like 50 boots laying there. Yeah. Of all the other guys that got their leg chopped off, and all they did was hand you a bottle of whiskey, put a piece of leather or a stick in your mouth and tell you better figure this out because we're about to chop your leg off. I mean, the gruesomeness of that is unbelievable.
Most of the casualties, or the ones that died, they didn't die from the initial wound that they suffered. They died from the medical care that they received.
And disease and infection.
Because what these Minet balls did was they shattered the bones, and so that all becomes shrapnel. That gets infected, and they ended up having to cut the whole limb off.
Yeah, yeah.
You get today you get a bullet wound in your arm. Okay, they'll go in there, they'll dig it out and fix you up.
And you'll be asleep during it,
right?
Instead of being wide awake with a piece of leather in your teeth.
And you keep the limb. Whereas there, it's like no, much. It's either your life or your limb. I mean, that's where that expression comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. I just look at how easy we have life today. It's unbelievable compared to what people that lived through that time period.
We haven't even talked about the dysentery.
The disease.
My great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War, that's another reason I found that out later that I'm related to someone who actually was in the war. At any rate, he had a condition. I mean, it was on his discharge, bloody dysentery. Well, you know what that is. And he went to the hospital for it. I mean, he was hospitalized in New Orleans after the Battle of Nashville. And then he spent time in Spanish Fort, Alabama. Also, he was in the 5th Minnesota Infantry.
You think about the disease among those soldiers, north and south, when you're taking 100,000, 400,000, 500,000 people sometimes at a time in some of these camps, and think of the living conditions that they had. There's not like, you don't have the sanitation company coming in and exchanging the porta potties at that point. I mean, it's amazing that they were able to even do some of these things. But the disease that a lot of these, you go back to the Revolution, it's the same thing. I mean, a lot of the ways that you have those soldiers that are casualties, a lot of them were because of disease, because of malnutrition or the living conditions or the sewage issues. I mean, that's a hard thing to manage back in the day. And again, I go back to William Tecumseh Sherman. He talks a lot about that, the logistics of manning the soldiers.
Even though he was a non-combatant, that's how Willie Lincoln got sick, was because of the typhoid that was in the river water that was being pumped into the White House. Oh, we got indoor plumbing, that's great. Yeah, but where's it coming from? And, upstream they were dumping their dead horses and the latrines and everything else ran into it. And so, typhoid was huge, and that's how Willie Lincoln got sick and died.
I didn't know that's how he died, I guess. Or maybe I did. I just forgot about that.
He was only 11 years old. But, of course, we talked about that already, but how that affected Lincoln, his whole outlook on the war.
Yeah. So we've talked about your history with Lincoln. We've talked about Civil War camp. We've talked about Mr. Kind. We've talked about the cancel culture, and we've talked about the history of Mankato and the history of the river and the commerce. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about and go over?
Well, just the fact that it's really an honor to be here, and thank you for having me. I sometimes, as we were talking, I was thinking about what a debt I think we owe to our ancestors, and I feel very privileged that that I can sit here and visit with you. But when you think about what could have happened, for example, my great-great-grandmother, she'd been the wife of the gentleman that served in the war. And the story is he was already off to the war when the Dakota War happened, which he may have enlisted twice. I don't know. The service records don't quite line up. It says he was in later, but maybe he re-enlisted. I don't know. I have to find that out. But at any rate, family lore says he was off fighting in the war already when the Dakota rode through their farm. Well, the little girl, which would be my great-grandmother, so it's my great-great and then my great-grandmother, were caught up in this thing, and the Indians rode through their farm, and my great-grandmother was about 2 years old when this happened. So if she would have cried out, because, her mother's hiding her, basically, we may not be having this conversation. And same thing with my dad. He lost a lung at Guadalcanal in World War II. So in many ways, I shouldn't even be sitting here. But the fact that I am, I owe those people.
Yeah. And what I find so interesting is how we complain about the stuff, the world that we're in right now. We complain about, what's going on. But in all reality, I mean, we have it the easiest we've ever had it. And it's because of all those people. It's because of their hard work. They worked their asses off. They didn't complain. They did everything that they were supposed to and more. And they didn't expect anything from anybody else. They put their nose down and did it. And that's why we're here.
The least we owe them is respect.
100%. Yep. They did their best with what they could.
Yeah. They may not have been perfect. Well, we know they weren't. But we owe them our respect. And, getting back to Lincoln, let the man rest in peace. And leave his statues to hell alone.
That might be the title of it.
That's my parting words.
Leave his statue the hell alone. Well, Bryce, I can't even explain to you how much fun I have had in this conversation today. This has been so enjoyable talking with you.
The honor's mine, sir.
Thank you. This will not be the last time we talk. I know we will find a time and opportunity to be able to maybe even go be soldiers at the New Ulm Battery or something and fire a cannon at some point.
Did you want me to do the Gettysburg Address so you have it on record?
That would be a great way to go out.
And I mean, you can show it whenever.
Absolutely.
Seems altogether fitting and proper that we should do it today. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Amen. Thank you, Bryce. Bye, everybody.
My voice was starting to crack a little bit.
Awesome.